There's draft physics video presentation. Alright, so debunking the cowboy, the debunkers. And their kind of lazy and sloppy technique of proving anything or making an argument. So I did research on this piece of evidence provided by the fakers. And yes, you can see all the fakeness in it. Okay, and I'll probably kind of prove the fakeness. So this is a not-for-profit company that makes scientific devices. So they probably all pay each other nice salaries. But anyway, so you can buy this two-slit machine, right, for only $7,000, right? And so the irony is, I didn't realize that Veritasium is using this exact same device for the clip I showed from the Veritasium video. So I'll play that video after I make these arguments. And so they show a chart where, and I'll play the Yale professor stating this as a key fact. So they have this chart and they show zero photons. They show zero photons in the two-slit experiment. My simple argument is it can't go to zero as a theoretical fact unless you make the other pattern would also come up zero. That is, the envelope pattern would have to also be zeroed. And it's not, as a practical matter, it's not really possible. And I showed the other experiment that demonstrates. Is this it? Got so many pages open now. Yeah, there you go. So I showed the basic point is that this is way oversaturated. We know they wouldn't oversaturate it on purpose, and that the reason why it's oversaturated is because the only way you can see both things, that is, the only ways you can cover one slit and then cover the other slit and show how much light gets through, is if you have enough light to create that. And if you have enough light to see the envelope pattern when one slit is covered, you will not see hard black lines between the dots. You'll end up with obviously adding light, and there is no zero. No light gets here, no light gets here. No, there's none of that taking place. So I showed all that, and so in spite of that, that's just ignored as a piece of evidence. The one experiment we know of where they actually did the experiment and showed you the results. So in the case of this other thing, we're not shown any results in the sense that they're just give us the data. Now, if you read this page carefully, you can see where there's a catch to how they perform these experiments. An extension. As always, text spin instruments tend themselves to expanded investigations by injection of a TTL signal. The diode laser can be modulated so that lock-in detection of the photodiode signal becomes possible. Now, because of the noise rejection of lock-in detection, right? So as soon as somebody says noise rejection, you gotta, okay, what are they doing? They're filtering the results. Okay, so these are after being filtered for noise. And they're calling noise real photons. They're not actually noise photons. They're not gamma rays getting through the machine or something else. They're actually photons going through the slits. And they've called them noise, and they've subtracted them from the results. So it's an obvious deception. But anyway, using a noise filter. Veritasium obviously didn't use the noise filter. So they did include this video, and then you watch this and you're just, oh, it looks like, oh yeah, you proved something. Now, this guy, right, the guy in this video is the same guy who did a series of videos, yeah, here he is, that I responded to a few years ago. And it's almost like he's dressed like a preacher. Well, it turns out he's a Christian. Okay, so a Christian physicist. And that should be skeptical right there, right? We know how honest Christians are. Christians never commit any frauds. They never fool their congregation. They never use gimmicks, and bullshit. So right there is a little bit of a credibility gap. So he's the one doing this demo. Okay, so I'll play the demo because it really is illustrative of the problem here. And the rest of their pattern sucks. The images suck. The whole thing is pretty lame for $7,000. But the only part that's interesting is right here at the end, where he engineers.
There's destructive interference.
All right, so I think that's where you need to go.
How does destructive interference work if there's only one photon at a time in the experiment? Well, to prove to you that this is destructive interference, I'm going to cover one of the slits, which I can do with this knob here. By turning this knob about 1/4 of a millimeter.
Okay, so he's got a certain number of ticks you're hearing. So this is supposed to be now the double slit. Now the point is he's got this stupid filter on. You know what the filter is doing? It's saying if two photons hit too close to the same amount of time, like if they're too close hitting, it filters all of those out. So you're only hearing the ones that have a good distance between them. That is, if two photons come in the same second, it filters those out. So they have to be a second difference in their when they show up kind of argument. And it's not a second, it's a half second or whatever. So it's filtering out when photons come at a faster rate. And so now he's going to cover one of the slits.
I can cover up one of the two slits. Here we go. I've covered the slit, but now there are more photons striking than there were before.
So doesn't he sound just like an evangelist? Yes. So obviously he set this up ahead of time. This is all you see. He doesn't move this thing. He doesn't do anything else, because if he did anything else, it would be shown that the filter's on. So he's set the filter for this specific example, and it's a fraud in the sense that obviously when he's covering one of the slits, he's taking away some of the noise, and therefore the two photons that were rejected because they were too close together, well, now one of them's not there anymore, so now this one's getting counted. So all the photons that were too close together, now all of them are getting counted now, so therefore it's more photons getting through, because the only thing you've really changed is getting rid of the ones that were causing a noise signal. So now there's no noise signal being filtered, and so even though you've covered one of the slits, it seems like you have more photons. Well, you really don't. So, chicanery is all you can say, shenanigans, and it's all looks pretty, it's like so manufactured. I mean, here they're appearing like they're scientifically oriented, yet they're actually selling a device, for $7,000, blah, 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 and connected with being a Christian and making production videos about physics. Not too good. So let's do the we'll do the Yale professor first, and then do the how the hell can I have this many tabs open? Should be a law against it. It shouldn't be possible, Gary. There's way too many tabs. That's not right. What am I looking for? What the hell did I do here? This should be, that's not mine, that's not mine. It's got to be in this row here. This seems wrong. Double slit interference. No, that's not it. That's the Professor Lowen crap. Resolving power. No. Oh, I made a mistake somewhere. Well, let me just pause until I can find out where the hell Alright, it should be back. I think this is one of them anyway.
Going through the slit, and it'll come there. So let us say on a given day, 10 photons will come here. Well, let's say 4 photons will come here, with this one closed. Then let's close this one and open this one. In that case, maybe 3 photons will come here. Well, let's say again 4. Now I'm claiming that when both are open, I get no photons. How can it be that when you open a second hole, you get fewer particles coming there?
So I would argue, as I've shown with the other experiment, that you don't ever get zero. So they never did this experiment. They never have done this precisely or carefully. And it is, in fact, not a fact that there's zero. It's always additive. It goes from 5 to 10. So you see the difference. It gets brighter. It doesn't get less bright. Nothing gets less bright. Things just get brighter. And that's all that ever happens. And so this is his, he says in this video, I mean, this is the whole reason they have quantum mechanics is because of this phenomenon. And it's a fake in the sense that it's not an accurate description of what the actual experiment actually produces. So there's another example of the same guy saying the same crap. So we'll just do it again. And this time I'll point out, he did the same thing with drawing the two. Like when one slit's open, it makes a wave over here, a clump, a diffraction, right? And I could do him doing diffraction where he just says ignore the stuff on the side. Like the single slit doesn't produce any fringes, really. He just totally ignores them. And we know that you can make a single slit with 40 little, on-off patterns. So, I mean, they totally malign the single slit and try to pretend it doesn't create an interference pattern when clearly it does. And clearly Professor Lewin at least states it plainly. It's an interference pattern. It's not a diffraction pattern. But again, this will be ignored by the debunkers. They'll just quote mine, the facts, and pretend because one physicist is on their side, they've got it. That's all the evidence they need. They don't have to explain why there's a contradiction between what physicists actually say. And they don't account for that at all.
Per hour with one thing open, and 5 electrons per hour with the second thing open. Now I want to open both and ask what will I get? In Newtonian mechanics, there's only one possible answer to that question, and that is 10. Because we got 5 this way, and you got 5 that way, and you open both. Whoever is going this way will keep going that way. Whoever is going this way will keep going this way. They will add up to give you 10.
And that's what the facts, I would argue, do indicate. If they actually do this experiment correctly and without shenanigans.
Now, I told you, some people may say, well, maybe it's not 10 because with both slits open, maybe someone from here can collide with someone from there. And how do you know that'll happen? So I'm saying, do the experiment with such a feeble beam of electron. There's only one electron at a time.
He started with photons, but it doesn't really matter. Obviously, electrons don't even create the double slit pattern. It doesn't. They create a single slit pattern. They don't create the real hard off. It doesn't have the envelope. So electrons are different. The fact that they're trying to make all of these things the same thing is just such a rudimentary, it's a fundamental error. I mean, all scientists should be looking out for making that mistake. Looks like is like. It's a fundamental trap. It's so basic a trap to fall into.
The whole lab, it's not going to collide with itself. Then you wait long enough, and you have to get 5 plus 5 equals 10. And what I'm telling you is if you go to the location marked X, where you got 5 with each one open, when you open both, you will get...
Yeah, so this never happened. At that location, it was only half as dark, and you can make it twice. You can make the other side twice as light. So you can make the brighters bright, but you can never make the lights dark. It doesn't happen. It's not a fact.
Get 0. You don't get anything. That is a great mystery.
That's your great assertion, okay? So it's an assertion based on you having no physical evidence, no experimental evidence verifying it, and he states it as if this is one of the facts of physics and this has to be explained when they haven't described the thing accurately. It's an inaccurate description of the physical evidence.
That is the end of Newtonian physics. And I told you that something like that never happens in your daily life.
And it doesn't happen in our non-daily life. It doesn't happen in that world either. You just made it happen by caballing a bunch of circumstantial evidence and sitting there and making a bunch of assumptions about what would happen or what will happen. You didn't prove it. You didn't demonstrate it. You didn't physically do it. You just assumed it happened.
I gave an example with machine guns. It's a machine gun. This is a concrete wall with 2 holes in it. And there's some target here, you. And then you see how many are coming through this and how many are coming through that. Then you go there and you wait. And both are open. Somehow nothing comes.
Okay, so he said it again, and again, it's not true.
With the second hole in the wall, you're safe. 1 hole in the wall, you're not safe. That can never happen with bullets.
And it doesn't happen with quanta either. And their evidence is lousy. These are just assumptions. It's really bad. So I'll play the whole Veritasium video. So when I originally saw this, I didn't realize that he's using that $7,000. So that's what he gets. You get these high view numbers, you get lots of money, you can buy silly equipment, use it in one stinking video. And like I said, at least he did it correctly. He didn't have the noise filter on. But I mean, the experiment doesn't even display the whole pattern, so it's a limitation. The 5 millimeter thing, it can only move 5 millimeters, and at the distances, 5 millimeters isn't enough to go across the whole pattern, and they need to move it closer so they can get across the whole double slit pattern. Because he's got the same inadequacies in terms of the coverage. He's only covering the central maxima of the envelope. He's not covering the entire 2-slit experiment, which is a huge flaw.
Previously on Veritasium, we saw how our understanding of light has changed over the centuries. In the late 1600s, Huygens proposed that light was a type of wave, while Newton considered it a stream of particles. This debate appeared to be settled in 1801 by Young's double slit experiment, which showed light passing through 2 slits produced patterns like water waves.
Right, so we know that Young's experiment didn't do any of that. It didn't even show the right double slit experiment, the complete one. And it wasn't something Newton hadn't already done. Okay, Newton had done the impediment experiment, and he had done the opening experiment, which is the 2 kinds of surfaces. Surfaces faces each other, surfaces that face the world. So he had done all the surface experiments.
By 1900, it was clear that light energy was not evenly distributed as expected for a wave. Rather, on the smallest scales, it comes in lumps called quanta or photons. So the question is, how does this affect the double slit experiment? Here I have a more contained double slit experiment where...
So this is kind of funny. It's the same device, the $7,000 device, the counter, and the photo detector. So same device.
There is a laser, which fires a beam through a single slit, then through a double slit, and onto a screen.
So it's through a single slit for no purpose, right? It's a laser. You don't need to channel a laser beam. It's already coherent parallel light, so you don't need to make it parallel by putting it through an initial first slit. So that's part of the joke. I mean, that's why, at the end of this video, I think he goes into this roundness thing, so maybe I'll play that. Why sometimes they're round and sometimes they're nice little square lines.
Where you can see a well-defined interference pattern. There's a series of bright and dark bands, which are much easier.
So it's a pretty terrible image of the double slit, right? You can barely see the fringes on the side. You can barely see them. They're there, but you can barely see them. So it's a pretty crappy double slit pattern, right?
Easier to observe than when I use sunlight, because with only one wavelength, there are no other colors involved. This is what a graph of intensity versus position would look like.
Yes, and it obviously doesn't really match. Their graph is always, usually this is way up, and these are smaller humps, blah, 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 but we won't go into all that.
The interference pattern. What creates that pattern? Consider the bright spot in the middle. The light from each slit has to travel the same distance to reach that point, and hence both waves...
Right, so all of this just has to do with the geometry. It just has to do with making those lines longer. So it's all about where you're viewing the photons. That's what decides what wavelengths work. That geometry. Doesn't matter what's going in, so to speak. It just matters on how long those lines are and whether the 2 lines with a certain frequency, which point they'll line up, where they'll be on the peak of their wave, where the notches will be lined up, the notches on the rulers. So if I had 2 rulers and I put them at 2 different places, you could see where the 1-inch marks won't line up right, and there'll be places where they'll line up, like the 1-inch will be right on the 2-inch, or the 1-inch will be right on the 3-inch. So there's places where the notches will line up, places where the notches don't line up, and that's what dictates where you have a photon and where you don't. It just has to do with remaking the phase of the photon, and that's it. The broken photons, the out-of-phase photons, are still hitting those dark bands. You just can't see them as a photon because they're out of phase.
arrive in phase. That means crests with crests and troughs with troughs. So they add together and create an interference maximum, a bright spot. But if you look slightly to the left, there's a dark spot. Now that's because light from one slit has to travel on an
And should be said a less bright spot, because it really isn't dark
angle, and it has to travel
in the double slit.
an extra half a wavelength compared to the light from the other slit. Which means when this light is arriving as a crest, the light from the other slit is arriving as a trough. And so they cancel each other out. But if you go...
Yeah, there's no canceling each other out. They just interfere with each other in the sense that the frequencies aren't matched. And so therefore, it's no longer a red photon.
Further left, you see another bright spot. Because now...
And also the polarization is too big. See, if you took two red photons and you put them right on top of each other, right, out of phase, you kind of make a blue photon. But the problem is the polarization of the red is this big and the polarization of the blue is this big, and you didn't take the red photon and make its polarization smaller. So it's a blue photon, but its polarization is too big, so it can't be detected.
Now, the light from one of the slits has to travel a full extra wavelength compared to the light from the other slit, and so again they arrive in phase. Crests with crests and troughs with troughs, creating constructive interference, and so we see a bright spot of light. And that's how the whole pattern is created. But what if I decrease the intensity so much that there wasn't a whole wave of light going through there were only single photons? Then how could they interfere with each other because there's only one in the device?
Well, frankly, they can't interfere with each other, and if you do the radar experiment where you line up the antennas this way, okay, this is the receiving antenna, here's the two emitting antennas, and you just move the receiving antenna, or you move one of the emitting antennas, you can get the same pattern without the two waves ever being able to interfere with each other, demonstrating that this has nothing to do with waves interfering
At any one time. So would we still see an interference pattern? That is what we're going to find out. In order to make this work, I had to line up a very faint source, and to see where the light was going, I had to shroud my head in that black cloth.
Right, so all of this kind of nonsense, it's just this stupid gimmicky machine he bought for $7,000.
But I finally have the apparatus ready. You can see up here I have a frequency counter which actually counts the number of photons received per second at the detector. The detector is a photomultiplier tube.
So it's the same detector used by the other thing. It's the same little box. Who knows how well it's made or what it does, but anyway, it doesn't matter.
Which is capable of detecting single photons. It's like a very sensitive eye, like the frog's eye. Now right now there's no light passing through to the detector, but there is still a bit of a background reading, and that's...
Alright, well, I'll take the speed up to normal-ish for this part.
because I can't block all the light out of there. Plus
Right, so this is the normal amount of noise, just 7 photons, right? It's a tiny number per second. So in the other experiment, you could hear tick, 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 tick. You know, there was more noise, you know, and then should have been just noise.
There are cosmic rays passing through this room which will also set off the detector. I'm plotting a graph of the number of photons counted as a function of position across the detector. If you have a look after 1 second, the distribution seems random. There doesn't seem to be any pattern in the arrangement of those photons.
Right, so and it's obviously a lot more photons than the noise could account for. So all of this bottom line here can't just be noise. So as this pattern emerges, you'll see the truth.
As they hit the detector. So maybe it's true, a single photon can't interfere with itself because it's just a localized point. It has to go through one slit or the other. But just to be sure, let's add up the results over a period of time and see if any pattern emerges.
The clear pattern that emerges is where the zeros went. There's no zeros anymore. How come there's hundreds of photons where the zero is supposed to be? So we saw a zero on the faker's little graph. How come we don't see anything close to a zero? We're seeing 140. They can't be noise photons. They had to be photons that got through the slits, so obviously they're part of the experiment. And, you know, your little chicanery paper didn't account for that because it eliminated it through a noise filter.
Clearly see the same interference pattern.
So there it is. So they say the same interference pattern. Look, the same limitation. They didn't... We know the double slit is supposed to do the gradually on and off thing. So we know we've lost an awful lot of the pattern by only going 5 millimeters, you know. And so they've lost the whole pattern. The outside fringes aren't visible. They aren't detecting those. And so what you'd probably see, if I would predict, if they could do that, is all of that level, that noise stuff, would all of a sudden disappear out here, and then it would go back up again. So all the part you would consider noise, the stuff where the zeros are supposed to be but aren't, that would diminish if they just went a little bit further. Just a tiny bit further out, they would see that noise disappear and go to a real zero and then back up. But it's been eliminated by the fact that they didn't do the experiment well enough, quite obviously. I mean, it's a double slit pattern and they're doing this to it.
And that we got when we were sending tons of photons through, but we're getting it out of single photons. We're counting up individual photons. And that pattern is emerging as we aggregate the result.
Right, so light plus light doesn't equal dark is clearly the indication here. There's no dark here. There's just more light. So you can add light, but you can't subtract any light.
It's over time. But how could this be happening? How could...
One slit would have been, I guess I should have done that while the image was still there, because you could probably see my mouse. So one slit would produce this lump. One slit. Then the other slit would produce that lump. Okay, this 50% kind of thing. And then when you put them together is when you get these peaks. Okay, where you have the disproportion. But you never went lower than the height of the single slit. Each single slit is producing a certain amount of light that will get here. I mean, it'd probably be down here, obviously. So you'd have a lump there, and you'd have another lump halfway through that noise signal. And when you have two slits, you're squaring your opportunity to remake photons. You have 4 times the opportunity to remake a photon, and that's why you have these peaks.
Time. But how could this be happening? How could a single photon pass through both slits? Well, if we try to interpret these results in terms of the objects we experience every day, they don't make any sense.
They can if you try a little harder, and you just haven't tried hard enough.
A photon is something different to a macroscopic object.
It's not an object, it's a collection of objects. It has a ray length that you never talk about, but yeah, it's quanta, but it has a ray length.
It's not a wave and it's not a particle, it's a quantum mechanical object.
Yeah, blah, 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 blah.
And sometimes it seems like it has properties of a wave, and sometimes it seems like it has properties of a particle.
Blah, 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 blah. It never has a property of a wave. It can just look like a wave. Just like a wave of soldiers or a wave of bullets. It can look like a wave, but it's not waving in any sense that it wasn't mechanically created by any dynamic that forced the bullets to be in association with each other. Or where the soldiers are forced to be in association, they're tied to each other by a string. There's no mechanism that made it a wave. It just looks like one. And you're just falling for the fallacy of looks like is like. And it should be one of your first things on your list to do not do is to fall for looks like is like.
But ultimately, it is something totally different to anything we've experienced before.
Well, it really isn't if you think about it.
And that's what makes this seem so counterintuitive.
Yes, because you've given up and you've decided it has to be magic. And no. The pigeon in some guy's sleeve. I mean, magic tricks they fool us all the time. And we're like, how the fuck did they do that? And yeah, if somebody doesn't tell you how the fuck they did it, it might remain a mystery for your entire life. You'd be like, how the fuck did he do that? But the fact is, there was a way he did it. And there's a way to figure out how a particle did it. You just didn't think of it. You didn't think hard. I don't think it tried very hard.
So what is light? Wave or particle? The true
Particles. It's a collection of particles at a frequency.
answer, I think, is neither. Though if you want, you could call it a wavicle.
Yeah, I could call it a unicorn. I could call it magic pixie. I could call it gremlin. I could call it Sasquatch. I could call it UFO. So this is, and this is supposed to be high-level physics. This is high-level science, and it's as bad as UFO physics. This is truther kind of flat Earth crapola, where you just really don't want to do the work to really understand why you're seeing what you're seeing. You're looking at the little NASA, the astronauts on the moon, and you're not understanding oh, the camera has a certain optical limitation on its focal length, and that's why the pack looks like it's bent, or this is what you just don't want to do the work. So instead you just say, oh, conspiracy. And you're saying, oh, conspiracy against our reasoning skills. It can't be, there's no reasonable explanation. It must be some kind of woohoo. And we get past this promotion crap. So here he goes into it. The extra bit.
Why is it that the interference pattern is made by blobs rather than thin lines of light?
Right, so this is what Young saw. So this is the famous Young experiment, so to speak. And Young didn't even account for this, the little fringe pattern. And so that's what they got. It's pretty ugly as a pattern. Obviously, in full white light, you have the problem of the reds being at a different frequency than the blues, and the lines not matching. So it's a little bit, but you still see it. You still get the idea of it. But why are they round? And I've said years ago that it's because those are little images of the sun. You see, the sun is really far away, and the only light they can get to that first hole that they create, the aperture, the little single slit, they first put the light through before they send it to the double slit. Well, the only way the light can get through that is it has to be all parallel. It really can't have much divergence in it. Now, it can do this and this, where it could cross at the right focus, and it'll still get through, but then it's still going to be going the wrong way. It's going to have too much of an angular difference, and it's not going to get to the second pair of slits. So the only light that's really getting to the slits is light that's perfectly parallel, and because the sun's so far away, it's a little tiny thing, perspective-wise, and so that's why you're getting the full circle, because the sun is actually fitting, the image of the sun is fitting through the slits.
As it was in this experiment. And in the comments, I saw two common answers.
So the problem with lasers is a lot of people do the experiment with the laser beam here and the slit right up to the laser. Well, the problem is you're not getting as parallel light then. So you really should have the laser quite a distance away from the slits, because then you'll get much straighter light and you'll get a much clearer bar pattern. Or vice versa, yeah. Further away, better.
One was that the blobs were images of the sun, and the other answer was that it was due to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle.
Which is just absolute horseshit.
Now those were very thin slits, so it's true Heisenberg's uncertainty principle would be involved.
Not really, because they're really not that thin considering the real width of a photon, which is insanely small. And the only fatness it has is the wavelength and the proportional polarization. But if you take away the polarization part, that is, if you are looking at a stream of photons coming this way, they're polarized this way. Well, yeah, it's really big this way, but it's still insanely narrow this way. Photons are not a wavelength fat. They're tiny, tiny, tiny slivers of things. So frankly, Heisenberg is a pile of crap in that circumstance, because you're really not... the photon has a million choices of where to... There's a million widths of photon in that tiny, tiny slit. So you're really not narrowing the photon's position by very much.
And that light passing through each slit would spread out. But the reason we actually saw blobs was because they were images of the sun. So if the sunlight comes...
So I was right.
Through
At
one...
least by his definition. He drew the same conclusion I drew.
Slit, it diffracts out and would spread out onto the bottom of the box. And light from the other slit would do exactly the same. And where those two spreads overlap is where we saw the three main blobs. So there's a diffraction maximum created by one slit and another diffraction maximum created by the other slit. And those two overlap. But due to the light being in different phases, it cancels out in certain positions, creating those separate images of the sun.
Yes. So anyway, it's one of those things where you don't want to have your laser too close to the slits, or you get this blobby effect, and it's preferable to have more distance, because that means the light is more parallel. Enough said there. Alright, so the other argument that continues to be defended by Pirot and the troll, the cowboy, and again, these are the only critics there are, frankly. The rest seem incapable. I mean, these people can't make a civil argument, let alone the others are even worse or more lame in their efforts. This word diffraction. So I could play that Yale professor in one of those videos. He points out how, the slit is open and diffraction means this. Okay, it means a blob. So it means that lump of light, a coning of the light. And that's what he calls diffraction. This part and this part, the fringes, he did not call diffraction. Because it isn't diffraction. Diffraction is just this part. And obviously the slower this medium's moving, the slower these waves are, and the thicker the barrier, if it was water, the more perfect will be the roundness of these waves. So if I don't want round waves, I can make the barrier much thinner, because then I'll create less difference, and then the waves will just be kind of straight lines. So I can do different things to the experiment to make the waves look different in water waves, clearly. And what I can also do, which catastrophically destroys any sense of the fair experiment or getting meaningful results, is I can commit the ultimate crime of saying I'm not going to put plain waves in, I'm going to put agitated waves in. Okay, waves that are in broken pieces, little pieces of agitation and energy. So I can put interference in, and I get interference out. That I'll get stuff here and here. I'll get stuff coming out in different places because I put interference in. So they're still asserting that the single slit in light makes a bar pattern that has exactly the same geometric reality. That is, the two surfaces are clearly creating where the bars are. It's where the two surfaces create the same geometry, where the ruler, the ruler lines match up, ruler lines match up, ruler lines match up, ruler lines match up. The 1 inch matches the 2 inch on the other ruler, the 1 inch matches the 2 inch, the 1 inch matches the 2, the 1 inch matches the 3 here, where the ruler notches match. That geometry purely explains why the bars exist, and how far apart these slits are means there's more notches on the ruler because you have a longer ruler, and so they get closer together. So I want more bars, I just widen the slit. I want less bars, I make the slit narrower, because then there's less, the ruler has less notches. And that's a simple explanation for what the pattern is. It's clearly the same geometry that's creating it in the two slit. There isn't something called interference pattern and diffraction pattern. Diffraction is merely the spreading of light in an even manner. Interference is where you create segments of light, where you have destructive and constructive interference. So as soon as you got the bar pattern, you have interference. You don't have diffraction. And clearly, if I don't put straight waves in, right, if I don't put nice, calm, straight waves in, I have no expectation of getting calm, straight waves out. If I put agitated water in, I get agitated water out. And these idiots, these fakes, phonies, frauds like Pirot, think that's good physics. It's good physics to say we should have the expectation that light is interfering with itself before it gets through the slits. So before it gets through the slits, the light is all banged into each other and gone in all kinds of new frequencies. And then it goes through the slits. No one has that expectation. Nobody draws it that way. They're just lying and cheating and thieving the truth and pretending that they can make that as a valid argument and explain why the irrationality of their physics, which is somehow a single slit creates two waves that interfere with each other, but a double slit only creates two waves that interfere with each other. Why wouldn't the double slit create four waves? If a single slit creates two waves, why doesn't a double slit create four waves? They can't answer that question. They have no hope of answering that question because their whole science is garbage. It's unthought out, it's unfinished, it's incomplete, it's sloppy, it's lousy, and it's clearly just because they jump to a silly conclusion And they're so invested in their silly conclusion that they can't change it now because they'll look ridiculous going back and saying, oh, well, we were full of shit for 100 years. And so to protect their physics from being embarrassed by making huge mistakes, they'll just double down on the mistakes. And they'll try to deceive you, try to tell you that it makes sense for you not to understand. You can't understand that there's a huge difference between these waves being straight and these waves being like this going into the experiment. They're trying to get you to not understand that that's a huge difference, a gigantic difference in how you can do the experiment. And these liars and cheaters are sitting there trying to fool you. And I'm sitting here pleading with you, don't be fooled. Don't be an idiot. I mean, can't you see their shenanigans? They're saying this is the same as that. There's nothing like the same. Why are you letting them do that? Why don't you beat them up a little? I mean, why don't you give them what they deserve? Because that's what they deserve, is a raspberry. They're cheating science. They're just such fakes and phonies. Now, Piro did a video on his silly bubble theory. It's vacuous mush. It makes all dissident science look like a fool because it's so badly evidenced, so illogical. It doesn't explain how magnets work or how charge works or how gravity works or how anything works. It's all little vague baby talk. And he gets away with that nonsense. Fooling idiots. Well, stop being an idiot. Stop being fooled by people who don't do enough work, who talk way beyond their knowledge. It's just terrible. So anyway, so next, somebody want to try to make some kind of reasonable argument defending this physics, defending these crooked waves, defending saying there's no light in a certain location, it's zero light. Well, prove it with a real experiment. Real one, okay? Prove the zero. Prove no light. Light plus light equals no light. Prove it with something like a real experiment. Done right. Alright. Done my job again. I mean, you saw it. A Yale professor who doesn't really know what the truth is, who hasn't seen the truth, who hasn't seen evidence of the truth, they've just declared it. And it's plainly wrong. And the Veritasium video pretty much proves it. It is just one pattern on top of another pattern, and you get 4 times the product because you've superimposed twice as many little bits that can match up. And that's the simple truth of it.